All right. Hi. It looks like we've got a bunch to get started with. I'm Jackie Lembeck. I'm one of the attorneys here at McAndrews, and I practice special education law. Tonight, we're going to be talking about Special Education 101. So the real, building blocks here to have an appropriate program for a student with a disability. And we're also going to focus on and try to bring in some examples of some summer issues, as many families are now preparing for the end of the school year for ESY or extended school year services, and then for, hopefully what will be the start of a successful school year next year. I'm here with my colleague, Laura Attieh, and I'm going to let her introduce herself.
Hi, good evening. So I'm Laura Attieh. So I practice special education as well as Title IX. And I was formerly a prosecutor doing child abuse cases, child sex crimes, and juvenile prosecutions. So have a good baseline and experience dealing with child advocacy. So happy to be on this end of things, and hopefully that background gives some good foundation moving forward with what we deal with in education.
Okay, great. So as we go, we anticipate that you may have some questions. We will open it up at the end of the session for questions as time permits. There's a lot to cover, so we want to make sure that we get through the material for people who are taking time out of their busy evenings, and we appreciate it. So jumping right in.
So first, and I understand a lot of people here are probably familiar with education law, and you might have that background, but I think it's always important for us to go ahead and go through those, just the overview and have that foundation, because sometimes we forget some of those important things. So the first part really is FAPE. And what is FAPE? Because we kind of throw those acronyms around all the time in special education, right? And sometimes we forget what some of those mean. So FAPE is the free and appropriate public education. So what we're looking for is a program that's reasonably calculated to afford that meaningful educational progress. And a lot of times I think we think right off the top of our head that means it's academic only, but it isn't. It actually encompasses a lot of different areas. So a FAPE really includes all those domains. So it could be academic, but it could also be social. It could be emotional. It could be behavioral. It can be physical. And we want to be able to have that program that's reasonably calculated for that child through a proper individualized education program, which IEP, another acronym that we throw around all the time. So the purpose, though, of what special education is, it's really to be able to move the child into a reasonable level of independence and self-sufficiency that's consistent with their potential. So what does that look like? And what is FAPE? Is it the best case scenario, or is it the appropriate scenario? So specially designed instruction, which might be something that we hear all the time, are SDIs. It's based on peer-reviewed research. And when we are trying to provide FAPE, FAPE is based on an appropriate program. It's not the best program, it's the most appropriate program that we could provide for the child. So what does that look like? It's going to look like, so we have accommodations and supports. They must be provided as necessary to make that meaningful educational progress to allow for the maximum integration with non-disabled peers and to be able to participate in those extracurricular and non-academic activities. So the whole point is not to have somebody that has an IEP, so a student that has those special needs be isolated from everybody else. The whole goal is really to be able to have them integrated into the regular like the classroom, but just be able to make sure that we're accommodating all of their needs so that they can make progress just the same as everybody else. So another part of the FAPE is also about those transition services. So that requires by law from at least age 16, and it must be based upon that transition assessment. I need to note though, in Pennsylvania, the age limit for transition services that should be identified and provided for in a FAPE for that IEP, it's age 14. So it's state law, federal law, slightly different. So age 14 in Pennsylvania is when we should start to consider those transition adjustments. So what is eligibility? And what does that look like? So you hear that a lot because everybody doesn't understand it. And we often hear that a lot, especially with parents, because it's not easy, even for professionals, like we all are, or advocates or anybody that practices in this area. It's difficult. So what is it that we're looking for, and who qualifies, who's eligible under the IDEA? Because there's different acts that you could qualify under. So eligibility under the IDEA, which is the Individuals Disability Education Act, is different from other acts, like the 504, which is the Rehabilitation Act of 1973.
Okay, we just, we point out these different types of eligibility under IDEA because it is unique in some ways in that it requires that students fall into one of the 13 categories of eligibility. Most of the time, I say that it doesn't matter too much which way you get in the door, just get inside. As far as getting an IEP, because once a child is identified under any of these, all of this child's needs, whether or not commonly associated with that eligibility classification, need to be met. So for example, a student may have a specific learning disability, which is something like dyslexia, for example, falls under specific learning disability. But if that student is suffering from anxiety because of feeling like the work has been too difficult for him or her in general education, those needs, those emotional needs, still need to be met as well. However, there are some important differences between some of these classifications. So that is something that if you have a concern that a student, your child or a student that you're working with may not be identified under the appropriate classification, that might be something to seek legal counsel about. All right, so child find is what we call basically the term for a school district or a charter school, public school district or public charter school, including public cyber charter schools, their obligation to identify when a child with a disability needs services. So it is an obligation of that public entity, not the family's obligation. Families 100% can ask for an evaluation if they feel that their child may have a disability. But at the end of the day, the professionals working with the child's teachers, and the other administrators in the public entity, they are responsible for being trained in knowing when a child should have an evaluation. And a child should have an evaluation not just because the child certainly has a disability. They should have a evaluation if they may have a disability. So there has to be just enough here for us to think, okay, it's possible that this child may have a disability. We need to start with the first step, which is evaluating to see if that child indeed does. So child find violations occur when a public entity is not identifying or not timely identifying those disabilities. So children who are suspected of needing special education should be evaluated, and that includes even children who are progressing from grade to grade, so that just because they're earning good grades, just because they're meeting some standards, doesn't mean that they do not have a disability. It also includes highly mobile children, including migrant children. So many times school districts may receive a child that is new to them, but if we look in the child's history, this child has been enrolled in many different schools. That does not excuse the failure to evaluate that child if the child needs it. An initial evaluation is required when there's reason to suspect that the child has a disability. That is when the school district knew or should have known, is basically when we look at it. When the school district knew or should have known that there could be a disability. What are some of the things that we see that would trigger this evaluation? Well, we look for a lot of red flags out there. We look for things like poor grades, child who's struggling behaviorally, a child who is struggling socially, children who are visiting the nurse very frequently, especially if there is no diagnosed medical condition that would contribute to that. They may be experiencing some emotional distress, which is leading them to have those, we call them somatic complaints, that physical manifestation of anxiety, or they may be trying to avoid schoolwork and they may frequently go see the nurse. Students who are having a lot of disciplinary issues. These can all over time be the type of thing that can trigger the need for an evaluation. And very importantly, there's no minimum amount of time that a child needs to be in a school district before the child can be evaluated. So if there's enough evidence on day one that the school district knew or should have known that the child needed an evaluation, then that's the day that the child needed to be evaluated. There's no minimum period. The child has to be in school for X number of months or weeks before there can be an evaluation. And that is true even of children who are receiving tiered support. So like, for example, a child might receive Tier 2 reading support where they're getting some additional support to help remediate a skill. That's a general education support. It's appropriate to use, but what's not appropriate is to delay an evaluation if there's enough reason to suspect that the child may have a disability. When a school district or charter school is evaluating a child, what we look for is for it to be sufficiently comprehensive to identify all of the child's special education and related services needs. So what I think of, especially if you're going through this for the first time, is do a read through of that evaluation the first time and say, does this sound like my child? Does this sound like my son or daughter? Does this sound like the child that I'm here to help? And is this considering all the information that it should? So some evaluations on their face may look pretty comprehensive, but then when you hear about what the concerns are, some of those concerns may be ignored altogether. So for example, a child may be struggling with executive functioning skills. He or she isn't handing in her homework. They're not keeping track of their belongings. They don't have the ability to prioritize what they need to do first and second. That's a whole area of functioning that should be assessed in and of itself. If those are the types of concerns that someone has about their child, but the evaluation just neglects that area altogether, that may not be an appropriate evaluation of that child. One thing also to note here about evaluations is that for children who are suspected of having a specific learning disability, there are different ways that a child can be qualified. The former way of that was favored, I will say, was the ability achievement model. And that was basically a look at or a comparison between the child's cognitive ability and their academic achievement using at least those two measures on standardized assessments. And we would look and we would say, okay, if this child's cognitive ability is, up here, but their academic ability is much lower, then that, if it's at least one standard deviation, can be indicative of a specific learning disability. Right now, the evaluation procedure that's being strongly encouraged is a response to intervention model, which is really looking at providing that intervention and then seeing if a child is not improving after the implementation of intervention that's specific to the areas that we see this child struggle in, then that may be indicative of the child having a specific learning disability. Specific learning disabilities can be in many different academic areas. And it's also, like I said before, it's that classification under which dyslexia falls, dysgraphia. So many times it could be a little bit unfamiliar, the terminology that's being used, but that is one important thing to look at how the evaluation was conducted and ensure that it was appropriate. What do you do if it's not? That's the big question. So parents have a right to obtain an independent educational evaluation if their child's evaluation was not appropriate, and this can be at public expense. That is essentially a second opinion, right? If I went to my doctor assessed me and gave me a treatment plan that I thought, this doesn't sound right for me. I don't think that this person considered everything that they needed to consider. I don't think that the recommendations are appropriate. What I would probably want to do is go get a second opinion, go have somebody else who is also qualified also give me their opinion and then compare. That's exactly what an IEE, an independent educational evaluation, does for a student and the student's family. It gives them the ability to have someone who is not employed by the school district evaluate their child, look at all of the data, observe in the school environment, and then give independent recommendations. We can often think of it as somebody else out there calling balls and strikes. And it can be really important for families when they feel that their child has not received an important evaluation, because the evaluation is the blueprint to start that IEP. If you don't have the right evaluation to identify what the needs are, you do not know what to address in the IEP.
Which brings us exactly to the IEP, right? So the IEP is that actual written statement that forms everything. So this is the statement that actually says what the child's disability is, what's going to be developed, what's going to be reviewed, what's going to be revised. And the best thing to be able to do is to be prepared. When you have an IEP meeting, you want to start early. So you want to be prepared before you even get to that meeting. Because often you can see things at home that maybe aren't seen, right, in the classroom or in the educational sense, that you might be able to bring to the table and you might be able to address sooner, concerns that you have. So you want to be able to address all of those things and make sure that it's going to be a comprehensive IEP for your child. So when we move on to what does that actually look like? So it's the components of an IEP sometimes can be confusing if you don't know what you're looking for, right? Because there's so many different components, and the documents can be pretty large. There can be a lot of wording. You know, you could be looking at a stack of 50 pages and you don't know where to start, where to look, and how to navigate through it. So that part can be confusing. So to be able to identify what those key components are of the IEP and what you should be looking for in those, I think will help navigate what it is that you want to be able to address for the IEP that you're looking for. So to start off with, the statement of the child's present levels of academic achievement and functional performance. Now that's huge. So when we think of our present levels, maybe we just think of, okay, well, what were they doing yesterday? What were they doing today? How about this week? But that's not necessarily what present levels of the academic achievement is. You need to be able to look at what has occurred in the past, what are reports that we've had, what that transition is, so that you can actually see today, does that make sense? Have they made progress? Haven't they made progress? And where is it coming from? So that portion and that component of the IEP is really important, because you need to see, that's the first thing you look at. What are my Pels, right? What's my present level of my academic achievements? Is it still fourth grade level, but they're on eighth grade, right? So we need to start looking at that, and that's the first component of your IEP. So that's very important that you want to look at. Then you have, because that statement is, again, it's about the measurable annual goals. So you need to be able to see that, are those goals something that the child can actually achieve? And are we doing it the right way? Or is there a different way that we could do it? And maybe that makes more sense. So you need to see that in the very beginning. I think that's first part of the component of the IEP that's important to look at.
Oh, and I'm sorry, my slide is slow to advance. While we're talking about ESY, I'll add that it's important to review which goals are going to be worked on during ESY, because it's often not. We'll talk about that more as we get to ESY. There we go.
Yes, and we'll talk about that a little bit more in detail, because yes, it does make a difference on whether or not those goals that have been achieved or have not been achieved, and what you're going to work on in the summer or through that extended school year. So we'll talk about that a little bit more in detail later on. But that description of how your child's progress toward those annual goals is going to be measured, which is that's really important, because also not only how is it going to be measured, but when is it going to be measured? So what are you looking for? How are you going to retrieve that information? So are you going to be receiving it weekly, monthly, bi-weekly? How is that coming to? Because the last thing you want is to be able to get that information, what, 4 months down the line and realize, wow, my child's not making any sort of progress. So how efficient and how adaptive was that goal? How functional was that goal that was even in place? Did it even make sense? So when you can actually see that measurability, and you can actually define that a little bit better, that's going to give you a little bit more better standing to be able to identify, what are we missing? Is there something that we should be addressing that we're not addressing right now? So you want to make sure that that is spelled out, and that you understand what that actual measure of those goals are. Are there probes? How often are those probes coming in? Who's performing the probes? How are you going to receive that information on the probes? Is it going to be through an email? Is it going to be through a progress monitoring report? Trimester, so I think those are the things that you need to focus on, and making sure that you understand when you're going to be able to get that information so that you can move forward. So the statement of the special education and related services, supplementary aids services, all of that should be based on the peer-reviewed research and the statement of the program modifications and supports for the school personnel. So that sounds like a lot of legalese, because that comes from the statute, right? So to simplify it a little bit, is your related services and your special instruction and your specially designed instruction, that is all tailored to the child. So that needs to be spelled out, and it needs to be done so in such a distinct way that you understand what it is. Is it matching the goal? So we have a goal that we have, right? So do the services that you are going to put in place and the way that you're going to address them, do they match, or is something missing? Because often something could be missing. If we have a math goal, but we have all the modifications and specially designed instruction is just geared towards something that has to do with reading, is that really relating to what our goals are and what we have already identified as being an issue with the child to make them to have some, their educational programming and have that progress. So I think that's important, that you have to understand what that statement is and how to read it, which isn't always easy, right? I think Jackie would agree.
Laura, I so agree with you on the matching. And then, over time, I've kind of given myself this test. If I can't read the IEP and understand where this child is all day and what kind of instruction he or she is getting, then there's a problem, in my view. Doesn't always mean that the child isn't getting something appropriate. It means that there's a lot more potentially going on behind the scenes and nobody has written it well. And that's a big problem because, what if your teacher changes? What if you move and you bring this IEP somewhere else? That next person can't figure out what was happening either. So I think more specificity is always better. And then that, that carried out, making sure, like Laura was saying, that those goals are reflected in the services is so important.
That obviously, Jack, you just brought up a really good point. Yes, I mean, if we can't read it, then how is it that you can read it, or teacher that's coming into the classroom and now being involved with your child? How are they going to understand whether or not they are picking up things at the place that they should be, and how to move forward? So it is important to make sure that all of that is documented in clarity so that everybody understands where they're going. So the explanation of the extent, if any, to which the child will not participate with the non-disabled children in the regular class and other school environments. I think that this is really leaning towards, we would like, and the whole goal is for that integration, right? We want to make sure that a child that has these needs can be integrated into the regular classroom as best as possible. And if that might not be achievable through the academic, or because they require certain specialized instruction, that there's still other opportunities for them to be integrated into that regular setting, so that they're still participating fully. Taking out a child during certain activities that you might feel is beneficial for the child to be a part of, and that might actually help them, further and gain more. You have to take all that into consideration. So another big component is the appropriate accommodations that are going to be necessary for them to achieve their academic, functional performance. And there's also the consideration of the assessments. So in the IEP, and it can be very convoluted, right? There's a lot of pages, there's a lot of sections you have to get through. An important section that sometimes you can just kind of skip through and page through are the state assessments. So there's abilities for accommodations to be implemented in order for them to take those assessments, and to be able to have accommodations during those standardized testings. But you also need to make sure that your accommodations are necessary to achieve what your goals are. So if you have a child that is perhaps they have issues with handwriting and different types of communication on that level, is an appropriate accommodation something that's going to allow them maybe to have an access or assisted device, or something communicative wise that's going to allow them to better communicate and have a better result within their education performance. But also with that standardized testing, a lot of times it's tests, quizzes, pop quizzes. Are we going to be providing, study guides ahead of time? So those are certain considerations that could all be built in. And until they reach that age of those, the district-wide assessments, you might not know that, but something to consider when you're moving forward as they get older. So related services. So this could be an entire night of a seminar because there is so much involved. So to try to just give the most overview that we can in our time allotment, related services are going to be things like the audiology, the counseling, interpreting services. If you have a child that has either hearing impairment or that has different languages impairment, how is it going to be most effective to them? Now, counseling can be, and another point that we have could be across the boards. Could that mean counseling because of therapeutic individually, group for the child? Could that also mean parent counseling? And making sure that the parent is also on board and understands that what you're doing in the classroom is also going to be handled at home, because often we see that children can perform differently in the classroom versus being at home. So sometimes parents can see their child performing very differently than what a teacher would express that they would be doing and what they observe in the classroom. So making sure that that is part of it. The physical therapy as well, occupational therapy. Most adults, I think, would relate that to you've had some sort of accident and you're just looking to get back on the job, and what's going to help you get there. Well, it's different for a child. Occupational therapy is very defined and very specialized for a child. So that's going to require a lot of precision and a lot of identification. And you really have to hone in on that because occupational therapy could be something as just how they hold their writing utensils, how they do small things in the classroom, change switches, how they take different instruments in the classroom. So occupational therapy is a very big component for related services, but also that the mobility services, how are they getting from one place to another, is incredibly significant. A lot of parents cannot provide certain transportation, and that often comes up where they might have an issue with, well, my child needs this and I'm working. How is it that my child is going to be able to get to and from? What does that look like? So that's another component of those related services.
There's a continuation of a whole bunch of others. I'll give you guys the site, and then I think Laura may have some more prepared for this. But I just always humbled when I remember just how many things qualify as a related service, when so many of us, kind of get used to, all right, speech OT, PT, transportation. But when you really look at all of the different things, there are a lot of very underutilized services that are explicitly provided for in the statute and in the regulations. So in the regulations, it's at 34 CFR section 300.34, and that's where this whole list comes from. So, whenever there's pushback from a district to say, well, we don't do that. Well, yes, you have to. It's right there in the statute that these are appropriate services, and a parent or an advocate is not, bringing up something novel or new to ask for something like social work services or psychological services. They're right there provided in that. Okay, so least restrictive environment, to piggyback off of what Laura was saying when she was talking about the section of the IEP that says, where the student is going to be included and the priority, because it's a mandate that a child be included to the maximum extent appropriate. That can be a really complicated analysis. It, like everything else, is individualized to each student and his or her needs. It's also something that can be done, very collaboratively. And there's, a new framework for access and belonging that is out there from PATAN, the Pennsylvania Training Network. And I find that so helpful for IEP teams. It was, formerly looking at the SIS toolkit. Now we're looking at this framework for access and belonging, but it's really looking at, okay, what can we bring to this child to help him or her succeed in the least restrictive environment? And if there are answers to that question, if there are things we haven't tried yet to help the child succeed in the least restrictive environment, that's where we need to start. And if we've tried things and it's not working, then we have to work our way up this kind of continuum of placement, starting with the least restrictive environment, which is the child's neighborhood school with non-typical peer, with typical peers, non-disabled typical peers, and working our way up. And next would be, providing some services in that environment. Beyond that would be having some, time in special education classrooms, but still within that neighborhood school, working all the way up to, could be out of district placement in a school that is specialized for students with learning or other disabilities. Could also be services that are needed in a hospital setting, or even in, very significant cases in the home. So here we have kind of the list here, and that, the important part is that we're only supposed to get to special classes or separate schooling or removal when the nature or severity of the disability is such that education in regular classes with the use of supplementary aids and services cannot be achieved. So again, we're going to first look at what we can provide for those supplementary aids and services, and then if we cannot get to the child's ability to make progress in a lesser restrictive environment, then we'll look at a more restrictive environment. What you shouldn't see is predetermination. So you shouldn't walk into an IEP meeting and automatically have a team say, okay, the answer is the learning support classroom. The answer is the emotional support classroom. The answer is out of district placement. This should be a collaborative process. Parents are included as members of the IEP team, and their opinion should be heard on this. And those can absolutely be necessary and appropriate for many students, but we don't want to jump to that conclusion until we have data and we've tried the supplementary aids and services, if that's appropriate to try. Okay, and I see a question here, which we will get to first thing when we get to the questions section. It's a good one. All right, so placement is supposed to be determined at least annually, and that at least part is important. IEP meetings can be called at any time during the school year when they are needed. So if there is a reason that you feel that you need to convene the IEP team to address something that is going on, you do not have to wait for your child's annual IEP. It needs to be based on the IEP. So where are we going to implement these services is basically what we're looking at in terms of placement, and as close as possible to the child's home. And that's a big advantage to children, because then they are able to interact with peers in their community. They have shortened days for school, but when it cannot be achieved, there's no reason why we can't look out further if there's going to be a program that is more appropriate for that student.
And just to piggyback on that, like what Jackie just said, is that I think that there is kind of that myth out there that the IEP only is scheduled at certain times and it only occurs during that time. But if you have an issue and there's something that you need to have addressed, you have the right to be able to have that meeting and have the team reconvene so that you can actually address what's going on. It doesn't just have to be those scheduled annual timeframes.
Yeah, that's such an important point. And while I think it's reasonable for an IEP team to set, here are the hours that we're available to meet on this day. If you're not done discussing the IEP at the end of that, you're not done. Reconvene and continue that discussion. It's not like time's up, you're never going to get your questions answered. That should not be the attitude. All right, so extended school year services, kind of a timely issue for us right now as we're at the end of April. So these decisions should have, just been made. There is still time to adjust an ESY plan if it is not appropriate. I want to just emphasize that these deadlines are deadlines that LEAs have to local education agencies. So your school district or charter school, they need to meet these deadlines to offer extended school year services, but it doesn't mean that if what's on the table today in April or in May is not appropriate, that it cannot be revised. It still can. So students with disabilities some of them may need more than the typical 180-day school year. Most often, that is then a period of time over the summer where students will continue to work on their goals, and we call it extended school year services. I would say average is about 5 or so weeks during the summer of, somewhere between a half to a full day, sometimes only Monday to Thursday. Each district or charter school is a little bit different in how they offer it, but that's pretty typical. Because it's so typical to have kind of parameters for a program, this is a big issue where you get cookie cutter IEPs. And it's such a problem in my view because the kids aren't cookie cutter. And we all know that. And we all know that everything needs to be individualized. But yet for whatever reason, ESY is like the prime offender for cookie cutter services, maybe rivaled only by transition services, but that's a story for another day. So if a child needs more than what is prescribed in the quote unquote typical ESY program, then that child still needs it and should be provided it. Many children's needs may be able to be met in the typical ESY program, but some children invariably will not, and they may need additional weeks. They may need something that is more targeted to their areas of need, or additional practice of skills that maybe is not the best for extended school year services as they exist in the school district, or they may need a longer day than what is typically provided. The deadlines to issue those decisions for students who fall in what we call the Armstrong group or students with severe disabilities, that decision about whether they require extended school year services should have been made by February 28th with a NORAP by March 31st. And extended school year, because it's, kind of a quick turnaround between when those decisions are made and when they will actually go into effect, right? It's because that's kind of quick, we do have expedited due process hearings to the extent that there's something that needs to be challenged for ESY. So most due process hearings happen in the world of litigation actually on a pretty fast time frame, but these expedited cases are particularly fast. All right, so why does a student qualify for ESY? What you'll hear most of the time is just the first 2 of these 7 factors, but there are actually 7. So, I have to think that the other 5 do matter. So regression and recoupment is what you always hear. And I often hear it without even a real look at data to support those 2. We'll just, kind of a blanket statement. Well, we're not seeing any regression over break. If we're talking about regression and recoupment, we should have actual data. We should have, a data point before last summer. We should have a data point at the beginning of the school year. We should see when the scores, because all students do slide back a little bit in the summer typically, but how fast they recoup. And for some students, the nature of their disability is going to be that they require, extra repetition of concepts, and that when you lose a little bit of ground, it might take too much time to recoup it. So these are both really important. And I'm not saying that regression and recoupment are not important factors. I'm just saying they're not the only ones, and they should be based on data. Other things that are almost never discussed in IEP meetings, in my experience, are interruption of potential mastered skills. Some things are really important if in the middle, you're just about to get that toileting goal or something for a child, you're just about to get to a different reading level. That might be a very strong reason to say that a child needs extended school year services. Achieving self-sufficiency and independence is really important. It can particularly help support the need for ESY for students who have goals that are related to adaptive skills, their ability to take care of themselves, but is not limited just to that. Withdrawal from academics. This is one that I think is really important, especially for students who are having a social or emotional deficit, where, maybe just coming to school is hard. And now we take a whole summer off, and then we expect that student to come back into the school as if nothing happened. That might not be realistic for some students. And that's also another really important thing to think about, is what kind of plan do we have, not just for ESY, but for coming back into the building. So as we're talking about summer and services, I think it's really important to also think about transition planning. So the start of the school year for some students are going to be, is going to be a new school for that student. It might be a return to the district from out of district programming. It might be just a new building within the same school district. And if we know and we can anticipate that, if we know that the child's needs are going to need some additional support for that transition, that's absolutely appropriate to meet as an IEP team in the spring, so now, and come up with that plan. And can we allow the student to tour the building? Will that help reduce some anxiety? Can we, preview what some of the content is going to be from the fall to help work on those skills? Can we provide access to the teachers a few days before the school year starts, or even over the summer or over ESY, to start that pairing process for the student? These are all kind of common sense things that can make a student's transition to a new school year much more successful. And I really think that, going back to that evaluation section that we were talking about before, just the same way that if a child needs an evaluation at the beginning of the school year, there's no magical period of time that they have to stay in school before they're allowed an evaluation. It's the same thing for this. If we know that a child is coming into a new school environment and we know enough to believe that there could be concerns, we don't have to wait and see that child struggle in the beginning of the school year. It's absolutely appropriate to ask for a transition plan now. When looking at making that extended school year decision, there are a whole lot of information that should be considered, including progress on goals, progress reports, medical reports, other observations from educators or from the parents, test results, assessments. It should really be a very data-driven and well thought out decision about whether a child needs those extended school year services. And what do you do if you disagree? Well, in Pennsylvania, there's a number of different methods that a parent can utilize. There can be a due process hearing where an impartial hearing officer decides the child's case. There's also mediation available as well, where a mediator can meet with both sides and see if they can get toward a mediation agreement. And then there are other methods that are available as well, like a facilitated IEP meeting. When going to a due process hearing, I think it's important to consider whether having the advice of counsel would be helpful. In your case, there are remedies that parents may not know exist or may not know how to ask for, including compensatory education, which is to make up for past failures to provide a free appropriate education, but also changes in program, revisions to IEPs, independent evaluations. These are all types of remedies that can be appropriate in some circumstances. Parents don't have to be represented by counsel, of course, and they can represent themselves pro se. But when parents are represented by counsel and they're a prevailing party, the school district or charter school is responsible to pay the parent attorney's fees. And this is so important. It's called a fee shifting statute. So IDEA is a fee shifting statute, meaning that it opens up access for someone who maybe would not be able to afford an attorney, because if they were correct and their child's rights were violated, they're able to recoup those attorney's fees. And that makes it possible for firms, including our firm, to offer services to families, and we can often do it at a no cost to the family representation. And then finally, among the different types of relief that we talked about here, it's important to also note that there is a 2-year statute of limitations. So if relief like compensatory education or tuition reimbursement or outside evaluations, if that's something that you're thinking about, or you think that your child's rights may have been violated, child may not have had the right program in the last 2 years, you can't wait more than those 2 years, because from when a parent knew or should have known of the violation, there is this statute of limitations. So claims that are older than that can be dismissed, unfortunately. So our last thing about summer in general, and then we're going to open it up for questions, is that if you will be unilaterally placing your child in a private school, meaning that the district isn't placing your child in the school, but you are going to go ahead and pay for tuition for a private school for your child with a disability because you feel that you haven't been offered a free appropriate public education, there is a notice requirement. You have to give 10 business days of notice before changing your child's placement. So many times parents may be considering starting that private school for the fall, and that 10 business days of notice is going to come up during the summer. I would just strongly advise that if that's something that you're considering, that you do seek legal guidance on that, because you want to make sure that you put yourself in the best position possible to hopefully be reimbursed for the tuition that you are expending. So thank you so much, everyone. I'm going to pull up the questions, and then Laura and I will address them. Okay, so first question here. I asked for an ADHD diagnosis for my child, and the school district said they don't do those assessments and to talk to my primary care physician. This is a really great point. It's one of those where there's some truth in what you've been told, but I don't think it's the full story, or at least that's how I take it. Yes, school districts do not diagnose ADHD because they are not physicians. However, the reason that you suspect ADHD is, I would guess, probably because you're seeing something that is a symptom that may be associated with ADHD in your child. And that can absolutely be the type of thing that a school district should evaluate for. So you can absolutely make a very explicit, I would say, in writing request for a special education evaluation. You may also want to, outside of this, talk to your child's pediatrician about whether an ADHD diagnosis is appropriate for your child, but there is no requirement that your child have a diagnosis from a medical provider to have an evaluation or to receive special education services. Okay, how does maximum extent look like in general education? Should the general education teacher be familiar with the IEP process, follow all necessary accommodations from the student's IEP, and collaborate with the family? Unfortunately, in that district, it sounds like it's not happening. Yes. Special education teachers and general education teachers should be familiar with your child's IEP. They should be involved in the IEP process. And to the extent that the general education teachers are not knowledgeable about how to implement the specially designed instruction or the accommodations, that's something that I look in that support for school personnel part to see, is there ongoing consultation between the special education teacher and the general education teacher? That's one thing that should be happening. And then also, to make sure that the student is getting that specially designed instruction while in general education. So those are all things that it's, should be happening. And if a child is still not able to make progress at that point, then you may want to consider what other supports and services can be trialed, or, alternatively, if there's a need for a different kind of service. All right, question. What kinds of accommodations and supplementary supports can I request for a child with ADHD? Tough question to answer without knowing about the child, but I'll give a, just kind of a bunch that we see sometimes associated with it. So often we'll see things like repetition of directions, reminders, checks for understanding. We might see some direct instruction in organization or other executive functioning processes for a student who has attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. Some students might require a one-to-one, so an aide to be there to help with prompting, staying on task. For others, that would be more than what the child requires. I'm probably missing a whole bunch. Laura, I don't know if you have any other ideas or.
I was going to say seating, preferential.
Oh, yeah.
Sometimes is really helpful. If they're in the front of the classroom, sometimes they can be a little bit more engaged. Also, if they have that break time, sometimes that's critical for them just to be able to kind of get back on track. So that little break time could be different things. It could be pass. It could just be, bathroom break, something that just gives them a little bit of time to be able to get their mind back to where it needs to be for attention.
Okay, next question is, the staff in our district have frequent professional developments, but the general education teachers do not collaborate with the special education teachers and don't provide enough accommodations. So the students with special needs get segregated from their typical peers. How can parents advocate for more inclusion and the appropriate implementation of an IEP or UDL framework? That's a really great question. There are experts out there in inclusion that parents can sometimes see if their school district is willing to consult with. Patan, again, has a number of really good resources as well that can be utilized by IEP teams. IEPs are, of course, student by student and not really this like kind of systemic, the whole district. But I think if I were concerned that consultation isn't happening or isn't meaningful, one of my first things that I would go to is, again, like how specific are we about when and who's going to be involved in this consultation? So sometimes it might just be like, a monthly figure. Can we make that weekly? Does that make it more, likely to happen? Can we address a specific situation that is happening in the classroom by specifying exactly, when work will be modified and by whom. Sometimes those types of things can help problem solve, but a meeting about with a specific child's IEP team, including all those general education teachers, that if there's a concern there, would be a very appropriate next step. All right, how long should I wait to see progress before changing an educational placement? That's a really tough one. I think it depends on what you've been doing in the meantime. So if it's a program that's been in place already for a while and is kind of stagnant, I think it's probably time to have a conversation about what could be improved upon here. If it's a brand new program that has some good reasons for why we're starting this program, yeah, it might make sense to let the child, stay for a short period of time. For me, I think the data, how frequently you're going to get the data is also going to impact that. So, maybe getting some more frequent data if you're not sure at this point could be something that would be helpful, because you don't want to wait, like Laura was saying, you don't want your next data point to be 4 months away and then find out, okay, yeah, this really hasn't been working, and then start investigating a change in placement, which itself may take time. All right, and we are going to have to wrap up soon, so we're going to kind of try to go just quickly through these last. Does the student need to be in the district to qualify for ESY? If the district is the local education agency, wherever the child is placed, there should be an ESY determination made. So even if that child is placed at a out-of-district placement, that there still should be that analysis, and the child, even if they're attending an out-of-district placement, could potentially have ESY through the district's program if that's something appropriate. If the district has not offered an IEP at all for the child, that might be, a different analysis. Like if your child is attending a private school, and then it might be a question of asking for an offer of FAPE altogether. All right, a child who has mild to moderate autism, does that exclude the child from the Armstrong group? I would say not necessarily. It would depend on the severity of how it's presenting. And how does specially designed instruction look like in a general education classroom? Unfortunately, I think that's a question that's too broad for us to answer here, but we'd be very happy if you would like to email or contact us to have a conversation about it. And then as a CASA, what are our responsibilities for getting the child an IEP? That's a great point. It does not have to be just the parent or the school district who can request an initial evaluation. Anyone can do that. So if you have concerns, you can make the request. All right, and last one, if my child is not making progress and I feel that not enough data is being provided to determine what school program is helping my child, been on the same program and no significant progress as a parent, should I seek legal advice? I would say if you have that level of concern, absolutely. We do no-cost consultations. Can't hurt, right? All right, thank you so much. Oh, I'm sorry, so you said here the cost, yeah, no cost to our consultation, so we'd be more than happy to review the records and speak with you. All right, thank you so much, everyone, for joining us and taking this time out of your busy lives to learn more about special education. We've really enjoyed being here.
Good night, everybody.